Mhm. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this ASEN book presentation series. My name is Javier Carbonell. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm very happy that today we're going to discuss this book, Global Nationalism, Ideas, Movements, and Dynamics in the 21st Century, edited by Pablo de Orellana and Nicholas Michelson. Pablo is lecturer in international relations at King's College London, and he has written on diplomacy, critical theory, North African politics, and art history. And Nicholas is reader in international relations also at King's College London, and he has written extensively on critical theory, pessimism, international relations, informational conflict, extremism, and terrorism. So I'm very happy to have this book because I've always been a defender that both scholarships on nationalism and international relations share a lot in common, but they don't speak to each other as much. And I think this book, a great deal of this book does this, and another great deal of this book just maps, developments in nationalism all around the world. So I think this perspective is really interesting. And there's chapters I really recommend you guys checking this book. There's chapters on literally everything. There's chapters on Ethiopia, on Singapore, on Japan. There's chapters on material nationalism, on even the joys of nationalism, on viral nationalism. So I mean, everything is complete. I must admit myself that I'm a bit biased because I myself have also another chapter on the book on the co-production of civic nationalist conflict in Catalonia and Spain. But please trust me, go beyond my own particular position, and please do check the book because I think it's going to be really interesting. Also, so the idea is that I will leave the floor now to Pablo and Nick. They will speak more or less each one for 15 minutes. And then there will be a short time for discussions. And we'll probably wrap up the event in an hour. So probably around 6 p.m. if you're in the UK, 7 if you're in Europe. And that's it. If you have any question, please do submit your questions, written questions, on Zoom if you're participating on Zoom, on YouTube if you're following the live stream on YouTube, or on Facebook if you're doing it on Facebook. So any way that you send us a question, we will receive it, and I'll try to make my best to ask it to the editors of the book. So please, without further ado, Pablo and Nick.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Javier and ASEN, for inviting us. As you say, we are very keen, Nick and myself, to work on synergies between this corner of political science and our own corner of international relations, because when this work started in 2015 in a little bar behind a stadium in Baltimore, Nick and I realized this is, despite the name nationalism, despite the apparent and always stable focus on isolationism and, assumptions that nationalists like Mussolini go their own way, we separate from the world. From our international relations perspective, what became obvious is that they wanted to reform international relations. In fact, what this was, especially the new right, the latest wave of nationalist ideas that we call the new right, was a proposition for an international theory, which is why from 2015 onwards, we started developing our research as a history of these ideas. We wanted to understand how the ideas work because we are theorists. So our job is very much to take apart these ideas and work out their mechanisms, their consequences, their assumptions, and so on. By the end of 2016, everyone was asking us, why are these internationalist nationalists emerging everywhere simultaneously? The synergy between Brexit, Trump, Brazil, China were very interesting, which is, in fact, made us think about the bewildering variety of nationalism. I don't need to tell an ASEN membership and audience that from Napoleon to Bismarck to Stalin to Mussolini to Nero to Ho Chi Minh, Le Pen, Putin, Xi, Bolsonaro, and Boris Johnson, the variety is bewildering. And I mean bewildering specifically because many of these movements are not compatible with one another. Some are liberal and seek equality. Some seek all-out inequality. Others seek the establishment of a colonial order, other a post-colonial order, and yet others are post-colonial orders also based on ethnicity. Think Modi. others very much about maintaining inequalities, and they also range in extremism. So for us in the Department of War Studies, from political parties that can be quite vanilla, like the Scottish National Party, all the way to terrorist organizations that we're also researching here at the Department of War Studies. And it's also fascinating for us as theorists and students of ideas how compatible they are with other ideologies. We have the example of Stalin melding ethno-nationalism and its strategic application, ethno-geostrategy, to communism, but Xi Jinping doing something very similar today. Now, many of us Europeans would like to think that this was over after World War II. But it really wasn't. It wasn't in a direct way, because we had fascist regimes from the World War II that survived until 74 and 75 in Portugal and Spain, or Turkey, whose regime essentially, as Ataturk, survives to this day. And beyond the fascist dictators, the really obvious ones, we also have a return of ideas that have not necessarily returned as they were in World War II, but have returned with new shapes. Nick, in a moment, will talk in more detail about our own research, which is part of this book on the new right and their internationalism. But essentially, we are dealing with an idea that has been developing since Napoleon took over France in the name of this new category, the nation. And the history of this conflict in many ways is also the history of modernity, especially when it comes to human nature, the war between the Enlightenment philosophers and their ideas as to whether humanity is made in birth, our nature makes us, or we make ourselves. Are we in a place where our birth determines who we can be and where we fit in society and what nations we belong to, or can we make that or change that? How plastic is humanity? And I use the word plastic because the word plastic is fascinating. It links us all the way from John Locke all the way to Alain de Benoist, that responds to John Locke in the 2000s by saying humanity is not plastic. Humanity as such does not exist. And so we took an approach that was a history of ideas, essentially. In the book, you will see that in our introduction, we proposed the beginning of two things that we want to do with this book. And this book is, as Javier said, a collection of extremely exciting case studies. And in our introduction, we wanted to propose a very light approach-based frame that we want to bring to you, members of ASEN. And that is, on the one hand, we think that studying the history of these ideas reveals their commonalities, the conditions of these commonalities, and why they join and can't join. But we think also that taking a historical approach can account for this bewildering variety and create links amongst debates in different spaces in studying nationalism. But finally, we also think that studying the history of ideas is the only way to truly understand how the ideas themselves work and how they have changed to absorb other aspects. So one of the most interesting things about the new right is that they hate neoliberalism and yet have neoliberal means of reform. Nick will talk about it in a second. And so we explained in many ways through the history, but also the history of the present, how these changes in nationalist ideas, and we're again talking about a bewilderingly wide family, that we wanted to bring together, which is why we did the workshop from which this book came. This book was a very happy outcome of a workshop funded by Visa 3 years ago here that Nick and I hosted here at King's College, where we wanted to explore the variety. We wanted to establish what was in common between them, and we wanted to set ourselves the challenge. If we have this incredible collection of chapters on different versions of nationalism, how can our historical and study of ideas approach bring them together and provide an understanding that can go across in all of them? So just to sum up my introductory sequence to our book, this book exists because we wanted to bring together disparate case studies. We wanted to look at ideas, movements, and how these are linked to one another. We felt it was important to bring to the study of nationalism, not the history of nationalist movements and nationalist statehood like Breuer does, but the history of nationalist ideas, and a history that from the very beginning does not pretend this is one idea. We wanted to map and explode this variety. And for our part, we wanted to contribute very specifically on a field that we call reactionary internationalism, that I'll let Nick tell us more about.
Nick, you're muted, I think.
There we go. I've managed to unmute myself. There we go, showing I'm not technologically savvy. Thank you very much for inviting us to come and talk about this book. And obviously, this is a somewhat intimidating audience to come and speak to. So, you know, I won't I won't do the basics here. I mean, for all the sunny uplands promised in the 1990s, you for sure know, right, that history is not over and that history is nationalist, or large bits of history are nationalist, right? Today, around the world, nationalists are the loudest voices on the big questions facing our societies, on climate change, on refugees, on societal failure, on liberalism and the vision of the Enlightenment, on all the big questions that are facing humanity. Nationalists are speaking, they're speaking loudly, and they're speaking coherently. They're not speaking with one voice, of course, right? And this is really what our book is about. I'll come in a moment to why we think it's important to think about nationalism in this very moment, and what kind of questions there are to be asked about the nationalist situation we're in. But nationalism is on the rise, and it's on the rise globally, right? And what that means, I hope, as we flesh out in the book, is that we have to do a huge amount of work to unpick the detail of what that story means in different places. And I hope, it was certainly for me when I read the book, and I look at it, what I think is so enriching about it is that you really do get the sense of an incredible diversity of stories here. And in a moment, I'll talk about the new right and our own account of the problems of nationalism. But it's always important, I think, when studying nationalism to recognize is that nationalism is a positive thing for many actors around the world, and it has fundamentally different significance for different political cultures. So it's almost universally declaimed and criticized quality in the West is not the same elsewhere in the world. And I think some of the interesting elements of the book are that we pick out these differences. But look, why does it matter that nationalism is back? It didn't go away, but why does it matter that it's back in the public eye? Well, it's because something is going on globally at the moment. Something is happening. What seemed like opportunistic alliances between nationalist politicians. Let's think of Xi and Putin right now, right? But also think of these opportunistic alliances between nationalists in democratic states, linking with authoritarian states, tying together, theocratic regimes with post-Soviet nationalists, with Latin American nationalisms. All of them are in some way singing to the same kind of hymn sheet globally, right? They have a sense of commonality worldwide, and there is a kind of vision of an international compact arising. And it's that sense that we're looking at something that's not only global in the sense that it has a global spread, but international in the sense that there is a sort of an almost coherent vision for radical normative change in international relations tied with global nationalism. That's what really drives Pablo and I's interest in this field. That's what we work on. And that's to some extent why this book is important, we think, at this moment, both politically and socially worldwide. There is a unifying set of discourses that are found in remarkably dissimilar nationalist organizations. And some of the key things that tie them together are accounts of the way in which culture and birth are linked together. And this is an idea we've developed extensively, right? The sense that the new right really developed in the lineage that's come out of the Benoist, that if you have some who you are, where you're born, your place of birth has some kind of fundamental link to a cultural form, inscribed somehow by your parental lineage, that you have a particular access to a set of meanings. Right? This is an incredibly powerful idea, right? There's a reason why it's powerful. It's incredibly common sense that where you're born, where you are located, gives you a particular access to a set of meanings, a set of truths about the world. Like, this is an incredibly widespread idea throughout societies, indeed, right through liberal societies, right? This sense that your place of birth it matters for defining who you are. This is not an easy idea to shake, right? And because this idea has such an intuitive power, it provides a space in which you can have a remarkably strong sets of kind of coalition processes between national populists in very different places. So whether the USA or the UK or France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Holland, Hungary, or in Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, China, or Russia, right? This story, this account that there's some real truth there that ties you and what your meaning is, right, to your place of birth, right? And this gives us space for coalition. And that coalition is directed around a desire to dismantle liberal international norms, particularly rights and rules-based multilateralism, replace them with a different account of the way in which international politics should be governed, right? A set of visions of sovereignty tends to be a prioritization of transactional deal-making, an assumption that we need to take into account geopolitical spheres of respective competency defined by cultural meaning and cultural belonging, right? So these actors worldwide, these nationalist actors, are speaking in words that seem increasingly aligned and acting through international institutions in ways that are increasingly aligned, right? They cohere in their sense of what they believe are the true meanings at the heart of human existence, and they cohere in the kinds of pattern of international interaction that they think are needed to correct the undesired impacts of what they collectively deem as globalist institutions that are antipathetic to those cultural meanings that define you by reference to your place of birth. So nationalism is both an ontological frame that ties together quite diverse sets of actors, right? So Trump, Putin, Orban, Xi, Modi, Johnson, Le Pen, Bolsonaro, Salvini, these are not, the same kinds of actors, right? They are really, really different politicians. And yet there are exciting and important places in which they seem to be speaking in alignment globally. They're not uniform. They're not uncontentiously related to each other, but there is an ecosystem of nationalisms worldwide. So when we speak about global nationalism, we're not speaking just in the name of a desire to take account of difference. The reason that this book matters is that it's pulling our attention, or we hope it will pull attention, to the way in which there are common practices and a remarkably coherent agenda tying these ideas together. So this cohesiveness is something that matters to us. And I think that when you look at the world today, you can see something is happening in international order. Right? Something is happening and it is changing, and it's not changing in a way that necessarily predicts sustained peace. Right? It's changing in a way in which contentious deal making becomes a much more permanent and natural element of international politics, where nationalist leaders they are speaking very clearly that they want to see exclusive geopolitical, military, and economic spheres around their birth cultures. Right? The kind of vision of international order being shaped here, and that you can see very clearly in Putin's account of why he went into Ukraine, right? This is not a story that only belongs to Putin. This is a story that chimes and resonates worldwide. This is why, to whisper it, Putin is not as disliked globally as he is in Europe. Is because there are elements of this narrative that chime with the sense that where you were born dictates a relationship to a culture, and that politics should be there to protect that culture. And that culture may be transnational. It may move beyond borders. So look, I don't think we need to go through the argument of the book in more detail. I'm much more interested, I think, in having time to have discussions and questions. But for me, why it matters to think about global nationalism is twofold. One, we have to see its diversity. And two, we have to see that diversity is coming together in a song that speaks today and is shaping and reshaping international order. And I think, being as pessimistic as possible, the reason that nationalist ideas matter is because they're deeply rooted in global intellectual history, but they're also sophisticated and coherent accounts of political ontology. They are functional, and the kinds of visions of international order they proffer may also be functional. And I hope that's what we can have a conversation about over the next hour.
Thank you very much, Nick. Should we go on to the questions, or Pablo, do you want to add something?
I'd rather going through the questions, and if we have things to add, as Nick says, maybe we can do it in and through the questions.
Okay, perfect. So there are a couple of questions that have been coming in. Sorry, so let me just make sure that I have them here. So the one question asks you, what are the, about this analysis that you've been doing about reactionary internationalism and the different conflicts and positions of different nationalisms, or new nationalisms within each other, or new rights within each other. Has this changed with the war in Ukraine? I mean, one of the measures that I think you mentioned is that the liberal internationalism is the main enemy of many of these new right movements. But is this the case still with the war in Ukraine? And has this relationship affected or changed with Russia's and between Russia's and the rest of the European countries' new right? Right. So is this changing? Are we seeing these new rights conflicting against each other or not so much? Let's start with that.
I think there are several answers to this. I'll give one, and I'm sure Nick will have a probably much better one as well to add. And it's also a chance to add something very important. One of the most remarkable aspects of our historical journey from Napoleon until today is how violence amongst different identities is theorized by different nationalists. Two nationalists going to war with one another is not a problem. It's the predicted form of interaction between international relations. And it's fair enough that the forms of nationalism, or nationalism versus liberalism, should go to war. Identity war is the normal currency of the world, of survival. Is not to be repressed, quite the opposite, is to be allowed, as Nick said, so that nations can fulfill themselves. So yes, I suppose some new right movements like Meloni have made very last minute, like Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, last minute moves to denounce we're not with Putin anymore. We used to get some money from him, but we are kind of clean now. But others are not. Vox in Spain says that Putin makes good points and he doesn't agree with the whole invasion approach, but women and race and migration, Putin has got it right, better than Europe. Orban and Poland are fascinating examples because Orban is with Russia, but Poland is very much against Russia when it comes to identity, is their big other, but agrees with Hungary, Spain, Vox rather, and Johnson and Boris Johnson, that this is all happening because Europe is imposing liberal norms unfairly on countries and changing cultures and destroying their birth cultures. So I think it's quite interesting, the reaction of nationalists to Putin. And as Nick said, I would go beyond Europe. I was recently asked by a journalist in Brazil, in O Globo, to explain why so much of the Latin American far left is so enamored with Putin now. Because he's proposing another internationalism. Maybe, yes, some people are fooled into thinking that this is still the Soviet Union, but I think it's really the anti-American bit that is very effective here. And this goes back to Nick's alliances between these different blocks, but also nationalism as an answer, as a resurgent answer to problems of our time. Nick?
Yeah, so I think, we're going to sing to the same song here, because look, there is obviously a very complex, there are two ways in which we can answer this. The first is to look at the kind of detail of the relationships, the intellectual relationships that run between Russian thinkers and thinkers across Europe and then beyond. And of course, those are there, right? There is a network, as it were, of intellectual global relationships between the French Nouvelle Droite, paleoconservatism in the US, the conservative revolution in post-war Germany, and also the kind of conservative movements within Russia, the Dugans and so on, right? There are quite a lot of intellectual commonalities, and at the end of the day, they share a quite deeply traditionalist approach. So there are key themes that are common, right? And they've already been mentioned. Issues around gender are really important. They're not side issues, right? Questions around gender roles, these are core to the way in which these nationalists understand these new nationalists understand their role. There are relationships with tradition, ways of thinking about modernity and the Enlightenment, right, that are not light, right? These are not casual intellectual movements. They have a fairly substantive critique of modernity and of the way in which we need to think about the relationship between progress and modernization, right? They've developed essentially a response to the post-1960s kind of intellectual developments in the West, right? And in the process of developing that response, right, they have read all of the left-wing movements that they're critiquing, and they fully understand these arguments. These are not kind of lightweight thinkers, right? The reason that there is this network of intellectual relationships that runs between Europe and Russia and beyond, right, is that they share fundamentally deep intellectual concerns with thinking about history, thinking about the role of the state in history, thinking about the role of culture in history, of tradition, right? So, for all the running for the doors that you're seeing in the new right across Europe with the war in Ukraine, those core intellectual problematiques, right, that they share, they really matter, right? They're not going anywhere because they're rooted in shared intellectual concerns, right? And they're also rooted in shared reading and then shared borrowing, right? So they borrow from Gramsci, they borrow from a bunch of people on the left, and they've imported into nationalism ideas that they find useful in mobilizing around the political concerns of the last sort of 20 to 30 years. So to some extent, things have changed less than they might appear, would be my first answer, right? So, lots of new right movements are distancing themselves, but at root, the ideas are common. Having said that, I think we see some also really interesting things going on in the fracturing of the new right in Europe, because Putin actually played a kind of heroic image, and still does, in lots of these online networks. He's this kind of perfect representative of the kind of masculine nationalist, the traditionalist, and he's carefully nurtured this image. So there's also something interesting here in how nationalists deal with the blunt arrival of geopolitical struggle and war in the midst of what was previously a kind of attempt to provide a quite even ideological space in which communication and collaboration was possible. So I think it is interesting in as much as it shows how nimble nationalists can be, right? As in, it's not a sterile, stuck in the mud kind of ideological architecture. The new nationalists are incredibly mobile to their local context. And again, it's another reason why this book, I think, is important in speaking to the local context. Because to understand how nationalists are collaborating today is also to see how they can move quickly to meet local needs. Right? And I think that's what you're seeing in Europe, and very effectively. Meloni's a really good example of this. That is one nimble ideological and political operator. And I think you can see, you'll see more of that going on. Do I think anything's fundamentally changed because of the war in Ukraine? No, and here's why. Because I think it's highly likely that whatever comes out of the war, right? I mean, I think most people accept that Putin's not going to be able to take the whole of Ukraine. And my own instinct is that he stopped seeing that as a viable military agenda. So I think the outcome of it is much more likely to be a kind of bleeding wound at the edge of Europe, right, which reasserts the existence of a sphere of influence even in failure. Right, so the real lesson that Putin wants to communicate to the globalists he has in his sights is that there are spaces where cultural reach should dictate political competence. Right? And that is the message that Xi likes, right? That around China, particularly in Taiwan, cultural commonality should have political significance. And Putin is making this point very, very bluntly. It's terribly awkward now, but that is a message that nationalists agree with. Right? So for all the war crimes accusations, I think that there are less tears about what Putin's doing than you might think from the way in which they're distancing themselves. So I think there are, I don't think it's broken the agenda, the international nationalist agenda. I think it remains in question, I think, how it will play out. But I think the likely outcome is that it will strengthen the spheres of influence vision that they are committed to. What it has done, though, I think, is place nationalists in the United States, right, and in some bits of Europe, in a position that they have to reposition their discourse quite quickly. And so it's driving them towards a slightly different way of framing birth culture. And I think, let me pass over to Pablo if you wanted to add anything on that. But
yeah, and in fact, I think they're going to be fighting to explain how, for instance, Britain, which is essentially about to denounce and leave the European Treaty on Human Rights, which is also what Putin did as soon as he took office, they're going to struggle to explain, no, we're not the same, even though they're both doing it out of case of sovereignty. But this is an inconvenient awkwardness. I think Meloni, as Nick says, is a spectacular example of how you can turn everything around in 6 months. We've got a few more questions. I'm going to tackle them quite quickly. The bar Dempsey's was behind Camden Yards, but I'm afraid it's been closed for quite a few years. I'm really sorry. Now, to the substantial questions. Does adding theories of nationalism affect the classic debates in IR? It absolutely does. Nick published an exceptional paper that he called Minor Theories, where he proposes that we should consider nationalism as yet one of the many views of international relations. And doing so has a catastrophic effect on IR, because in the first instance, it reveals just how much of international relations is incredibly nationalist and often ethno-nationalist. including swathes of realism, but also Marxism and bits of liberalism. Wilsonian liberalism and self-determination is entirely based on we avoid war by giving its racial nation its own space, and then there is no reason for them. So to be perfectly honest, they're doing the same as a lot of ethno-nationalists in Western Europe now, saying that cohabitation is the reason. The next question, are we seeing an internationalism of certain nationalists that non-populist nationalists are failing to engage with? I don't think they're failing to engage with it. And I would make a case that maybe answers the question. Xi Jinping, I don't think, is a populist in the sense of what the populism you mean is. I think the populist nationalist in China was Bo Xilai. And he was a very, very popular and much more populistic and much more successful rival to Xi Jinping, which is why he had to be got out of the way with that whole scandal, poisoned Englishman and all that.
Can I ask you something regarding this? Because I think this question, the second part of the question is interesting as to what is the response, what should be the normative or political response to these movements, right? So international collaboration is one of the great examples of problems are global, so we need global solutions, and the new nationalism are a path against this trend, but we just need to reinforce collaboration in order to prevent this. I mean, does this have any purchase, or is this going to?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
What should one do against this?
Yeah. And they have incredible collaborations. The last COP on climate change is fantastic because all the nationalists basically agreed not to do anything internationally, other than not do anything internationally, and especially stop migration. That Boris Johnson opened the previous COP in Glasgow by saying the problem with this is, and this is what we need to address. So there is a fantastic essay by Bolsonaro's big thinker and foreign secretary that is called Trump and the West and the Future of the European peoples, that tells us about how these collaborations, as Nick said, are very opportunistic and they're issue by issue, and very often they're going to lead to agreement to restructure things internationally. So this is, collaboration. They're not each going their own way. They're collaborating to break down the rules. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the International Migration Compact is gone. It's been gone for years. Yeah, and it was Salvini, Boris Johnson, and Trump that destroyed it. Major countries, and France quietly also voted for it to go. Because Macron was facing his own nationalist rivals. So I think, to be honest, this impact is not just onto populists and non-populists, it's everywhere. As Nick said, it's infecting everything. I would quite like to move to the next question, which is, a lot of other nationalisms have ended in war. Sorry, Nick. Sorry.
Can I just quickly come in on that was exactly it. So this point about can we learn from the past to prevent it happening again? So I wrote a book on pessimism, so probably unsurprisingly, I'm going to give a little bit of a pessimistic answer on this. But so I think there's lots of evidence that the fascist states of the 20th century collaborated. They collaborated around things like cholera management. They collaborated in a bunch of areas, right? So, collaboration in itself is not the same thing as internationalism. I guess the more pertinent point that we make in our own work, not necessarily in this book, but more widely, is that I think you do see something different about the new nationalisms, which is that they genuinely have a vision for how international order should be managed. And I'm not convinced it's an unworkable vision, right? It's not workable if your account of workable is a binding set of international laws, right, that limit the sovereignty of states, right? It's not workable in that sense, right? It's not workable if what you have in mind is a relatively equalized international order in which weak states have a greater say than they might do based on their brute power, right? So it's not based on liberal visions of what a good international order is, but it's nonetheless a functional account of how order should be. The account of order is that transactions should be primarily between the weak and the strong, that they should take place within regional bounds, right? So there should be some kind of recognition that proximity should dictate a different kind of relationship, right? The kind of norms that are being put out here, they're not just old-fashioned norms. It's not just a desire to go back to a more realist international relations. Yeah. It's more a kind of a sense that the way in which we've done things up to now has not worked, right? Their critique is of liberal globalism, and their argument doesn't come from a place of weakness, it comes from a place of strength. They say, look at all the problems with the world. Who did this? Liberal internationalism did this. We're the solution, right? So when you go to one of these new nationalists and you say climate change is a terrible problem, we must collaborate, they go, yes, absolutely. Why would we not collaborate if we needed to? But hang on a second, let's be realistic about what collaboration means. We're not having intrusive, Western powers coming in and telling us how to govern our countries. That's not a solution. You guys did all the polluting. Let's think of a way that's a bit more fair. So I think that we have to complicate the story that what's going on here is internationalism versus its enemies. Yeah. What's at stake here are two different visions of what internationalism means.
Yeah.
And the failures of liberal internationalism over the last 50 to 60 years are real, right? They're not just real in terms of the world being, in a parlous state. They're also real in that large chunks of the world have not become richer, right? Or at least they perceive themselves very clearly to have been losers from globalization. And so their account of the nationalists' account of who's responsible for the things that are wrong, it has a willing and happy audience worldwide. So I think it's far more complicated than just we need to have more internationalism as a solution, because they also say this, but they just have a different account of what internationalism means.
And this leads us quite nicely to something I wanted to say on the history question, because the question is phrased on the chat. When nationalism has become a factor in the international stage in the past, it has often ended in war. Yes, I share with you that a lot of ethno-nationalism creates horrific and atrocious wars. But on the one hand, remember that Putin is claiming that he's fighting World War II all over again and he's on the side of angels. Two, I would encourage you to have a look at European identitarians that say Yugoslavia is the proof that we need to fight a global war against Islam. And brown people, Yugoslavia is what happens if we don't separate them and we don't keep them out of Europe. It's what happens when you allow Muslims to colonize Europe. And Le Pen has mentioned this explicitly before. Sarajevo is what you get if you allow Muslims to colonize Europe. On the other hand, I would, if I were you, go to the Red Pill Reddit and search World War II, because you're going to see something quite sad. They see it as the old-fashioned lost cause. And it would also show you what Nick is saying, that today's nationalisms aren't necessarily the same as those in the past. They're not in terms of theoretical technicality. The core concept of fascism, for instance, in the 1940s was called razza spirito, and today is birth culture. And even though they both have birth and biology at the basis, they don't work in the same ways. And for instance, today's one doesn't need to mention the word race or biology at all. It just speaks of culture, even though it's linked and determined by birth. And I would make the case that in this era of fake news, where who you are determines whether you're the truth teller, what lessons can be learned from the past, up to how you interpret that past, which takes us back to the power of the nationalist ideas, because all of history in nationalism is seen as the natural, violent interaction of identities struggling to survive. But this happens everywhere. Today, The Telegraph has an article by a former and a present colleague, Brendan Sims and Charlie Ladderman, where they warn that today's meeting between Xi and Putin is basically like the Japanese-Nazi alliance in 1941, the Axis of Steel between Japan, Germany, and Italy, and that the West needs to react in the same way. So again, I talked through three different interpretations of this. I think in many ways, continuing to refer all the time to the fascist era is not very helpful to today's debates. I'd rather do like Nick said and talk about what are we talking about today. Does it mean that women need to stay in that position because they were born that way, and so on and so forth? And this takes us to the next question that is a very interesting one that I've been asking for a while, as to whether nationalism can be hereditary. Well, absolutely yes. You've put your finger onto something that has marked the nationalism of the last 20 years. Boris Johnson's real British working class is British born and doesn't need to be working class financially. It can have cars and houses and own capital. It needs to have inherited that claim. And this is very important, but you need go no further than American nationalisms, where even liberals in America, like Biden, are very keen to say, I am of Irish origin. I am legitimized by the quality of my blood. essentially, and my European ethnic origin. And this is exactly the same as to the American alt-right say European rights, i.e. white rights. So in fact, the same as seeing Russia as the old and new enemy of the United States, because again, but is identity. This doesn't need to be inherited between me and my child, but rather goes to my child because of the blood in his veins, and he will inherit all of these interests, right? Just like Russia, anti-West, and so on and so forth.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Nick, do you want to comment on that?
No, I was just I just saw there are a couple of other questions in the Q&A box.
Yeah.
You know, so the first is, do you think the rise of robust nationalisms is related to the dissolution of the global capitalist system? It's a super interesting question, and of course, there is undoubtedly a relationship here between well, whether we call it a return of nationalism, it wasn't a return of nationalism. Nationalism never went away, but the sort of the very clear rise of a particular kind of pattern of nationalist movement globally and the way in which they relate to each other. Yes, undoubtedly this is linked to global economic processes, right? And it's not simply linked to you know, the very obvious impoverishment of large sections of the world, and you know, the ways in which, you know, there are important links to the actions of the globalists, as it were. You know, the kind of neoliberal dynamics of global economic order over the last sort of 30 odd years. But you know, I don't see it as simple as a dissolution of the global capitalist system, though. I mean, and this is one of these points that draws our attention to the important differences within nationalist movements. And Trump, I think, is a really good example, right? So Trump is a nationalist, but he's not an anti-capitalist, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of in fact, in some ways, he's almost like a libertarian capitalist. And there is a heavy wing of libertarianism running through some strands of nationalist discourse worldwide. So there are complexities here, right? Their response to globalist capitalism is that, you know, the international regimes of capitalist order, right, are responsible for the impoverishment of societies and the erosion of their cultural autonomy, you know, and the weakening of their sovereignty, right? So there is a strong argument shared more or less globally by nationalist movements that the problem that nationalism is there to respond to is a problem rooted in a set of economic actors. But the answers they give are highly diverse. So some give state nationalist, protectionist responses, but that's not universal. You see there are a whole series of linked movements that have, you know, to some extent, a kind of a libertarian vision of how, you know, the state can respond. So it's not quite as simple as a sort of overlaying of old Marxian critique with new nationalisms, and there's more than that is going on. Go on, Pablo.
I would add something even more important. I would say it's not just capitalism, it's different visions of social, economic, or state or administrative efficiency that engage with the process of both the two processes of localizations and globalizations of culture. I recently read that one of the main reasons why Lithuanians were so angrily anti-Soviet and were the first to leave was a very administrative decision made by a minor bureaucrat in the Soviet Union to delete all Lithuanian language TV and especially movie productions because it was just not economically efficient. When the price of oil went down in the early 80s, the USSR had major problems. And this was deleted in the same way that real identities have been deleted by the economically efficient globalization of media by Disney. And in that regard, the nationalists are, as Nick said, do have a point, because the observation that my local culture is disappearing and is being replaced by more Star Wars or whatever Disney is feeding you, right? And that Marxism and communism were destroying local cultures, particularly Georgian and Lithuanian, which was very important to them, is not entirely wrong. As Nick said, really the trick here, the devil is in the detail of how that interpretation. Is this a global plot to denature nations to make them more pliable to either Marxism or global capitalism? Well, actually, nationalists have made both arguments. Yeah, some nationalists that are more lefty will be like, no, this is a capitalist problem. Others would say that is a Jewish conspiracy. Others would say that is a globalist conspiracy. There are many approaches to this, but they're observing and addressing the same phenomenon. I would also like to make another point that is not just capitalism. It might be something else, because we are, I don't think we're in capitalism anymore. I think we're in late modern capitalism, which is different. It's now liberal capitalism. And one of its core dynamics is essentially the dissolution and monetization of non-monetary aspects of life. Okay, our university pays us less than all other London universities pay, because it has a bit more prestigious name to pay us with. Non-monetary symbolic asset being turned into Nick gets paid less than if he went to another London university. So he's being monetized. Reputation here is being monetized. In the same way, dignity is being monetized. One of the biggest things that ended with neoliberalism, particularly in Britain and America, is the social dignity afforded by having a social identity determined by, I am the guy that does this work, I have this trade. The ending of capitalist trades, yeah, and the industrial trades, means that it also means the end of a social role, and therefore the end of me as a person. We have really strong social identities. We walk out into the street, hey, I'm a professor at King's. Everyone knows more or less what that means. They might not care or know what you do, but it's a very strong social identity. You teach young people stuff, complicated stuff, and that's about it. I would like, in passing, to begin answering the other question in the Q&A box that I think Nick will also have something very interesting to say.
Before you do, I just want to remind everyone that they can ask questions on YouTube, Facebook, on Zoom. So please do, if you have still one, there's still time. So I just want to encourage everyone to ask any question they have during the last minutes that we have here. So please, Pablo.
Thank you, Javier. Yes, please do ask any more questions that you may have. So George Andrea asks whether nationalism has been global, or at least since the mid-20th century, and has been global ever since then. Absolutely, I agree. Nationalism has been an internationalist ideology since the very beginning, is an alternative to other things, and has been an alternative from its very inception. Late 1920s, Italian fascists start meeting with Spanish military officers. You know where that relationship went. These collaborations were also at the global level to address cholera, to address migration issues, refugees, and other issues. So here, global, with the book, both the meaning of the global and the book title, I think, for us, George Andrea, really was, as you say, a re-emphasizing that the one now, at least, and the ones that included in the book are part of global trends that are, however, extremely varied. You raise anti-colonial nationalisms that are themselves fascinating histories of nationalist struggle amongst themselves. Indian nationalism, for instance, the most powerful example. It had the most liberal nationalist, essentially, of the post-war, Nehru, okay, who was a nationalist only insofar as give us independence, but then everyone in India is equal, explicitly destroyed his ideas and his legacy by a nationalist that thinks that real independence is essentially ethnic triumphalism of the Hindu ethnic group. And this is itself doing something else fascinating that is in common with Milosevic, which is treating a confessional group, like Milosevic treated the Bosniaks and the Albanians as just Muslims, as an ethnic origin, even though a religion like Islam, ironically, for this perspective, one can convert in and out of.
Yeah, let me come in as well, because it's a really great question, a really important question, the relationship between the national and the global. So you know, the book itself is an attempt to speak to, you know, the debates around global studies in probably a kind of a slightly humble way, really. You know, we don't make this point perhaps as explicitly as we could, but we were really trying to draw out into draw out into a global space and get mostly young academics, actually, from all over the world to write about nationalism where they're from, to write critically and reflectively about nationalism. So, you know, in a sense, it's about, you know, what nationalism looks like all over the world, but also what nationalism looks like from those places in the world. And that, I think, is an important element of what it means to think about the global in nationalism, which is that, you know, obviously most people who write about nationalism hold it with a critical eye, right? And they see it as linked to some of the worst things that we as a species have done to ourselves, right? But at the same time, nationalism is a is tied to emancipatory projects all over the world. It's tied to visions of autonomy, self-determination, most obviously, right? And you know, the reality is that to understand nationalism without thinking globally is not to understand nationalism at all, yeah. Right? And part of what we do in our introduction is to try and trace the tangled genealogy of nationalisms that plays out globally. And it is an incredibly complex story, right? The story is not one of straight lines, it's of rhizomes and tangles, right? And I think that is part of what we're trying to get to at the book. And I think we could have written 5 volumes of this book, right? Very, very easily, without too much difficulty, because that is the diversity of nationalism. And not only the diversity of its intellectual genealogy, but also the diversity of its kind of lived experience. Nationalism means different things. It means it has different politics. Its politics change over time. The Indian example, right? The Indian nationalism is not one thing. It's many things. There are many nationalisms even within each case study of nationalism. Right? So the global in global nationalism is to speak to this, to speak to its difference, right? To speak to the kind of multiple worldings that nationalism contains within it. But you know, the intellectual agenda is not only this process of diffusion, right? Because the intellectual agenda for at least me, and why I think we need to study global nationalism, is in looking at the way in which, I guess, world history, right, despite this difference, is nonetheless, you know, in this kind of let me try and put that differently, that this incredibly complex concatenation of nationalisms is nonetheless moving global order in a single direction. There is something happening that brings together this diversity, and that is reshaping that diversity in particular ways. Right? And we think certain concepts are becoming increasingly important across nationalism. Birth culture is there. We think questions around spheres of influence is there. We think questions around transactionalism vis-a-vis other international bodies is there. So there are things we think matter, right? But that, I guess, is up for debate. So there's a sort of dual move here epistemologically. The one is to say this is a space of difference. The other is to say, but there is something coherent going along that is binding that difference together in ways that matter for us when we reflect upon 21st century history, if that made sense.
I also think it's global in a more prosaic, more poetic sense, perhaps, that it was important to the choice of the title in that it's everywhere. Not just everywhere as in countries, let's not just do the nationalist thing and do it nation by nation, but everywhere as in from the university to the army to your bedroom. That's why we've got chapters, for instance, the Russia chapter doesn't deal with what we all know already about Russia. It deals with the micropolitics of training cosmonauts as symbols of the nation, as symbols of a specific vision of masculinity and therefore femininity and gender and birth, and so on and so forth. I think it's truly global in that regard, that it affects everything. And this takes us quite nicely to another question, the key differences between new right and fascist movements in the beginning of the 20th century. I'm going to do a history of ideas answer. Call back what Nick said earlier, that one of the most fascinating things about studying the history of nationalism is that you see the really unexpected influences or where they stole an idea and just not the rest. The 2 biggest differences are also easily explained with the 2 biggest philosophical acquisitions from other movements that they seriously disagree with. Yeah, the first is from Antonio Gramsci, the New Left, the idea that political change requires cultural change. And political change is therefore downstream from culture. There's a citation by Gramsci that was taken up all the way to Breitbart and is the tagline of Breitbart. It was until 2 years ago. And that which explains the culture wars and why the culture wars are not just symbolic, the symbol is the social change they want. Another big difference that my dad is always very keen, my dad is very old and lived under Franquismo in Spain for a very long time, and had the joy of being put to prison for having long hair. Publicly having long hair as an artist in Madrid. And he would tell you, Franco did big things. He built big dams, big roads. He's really interested in this pharaonic ways of changing society. I will ban the Basque language. I will, rebuild roads and railways in the country and so on. The new right, which is the leading, shall we say, set of ideas, compact of ideas in today's nationalisms, has absorbed from neoliberalism an idea of reform that removes egalitarian rules so that nature can sort it out. Yeah, very good example. Putin removed Soviet-era legislation protecting women from domestic violence to protect the family. Yeah, so remove a norm No. Remove human rights. Remove from international agreements that make foreigners equals, and so on and so forth. So essentially, remove what they see as an artificial reshaping of society that is making men and women and foreigners and national equal. And that is the mode of reform. This is really quite different from the huge programmatic, futuristic, fascist and Nazi programs of the 1940s.
I think we still have two more questions and a bit more of time, so we can take these two, which is, so the first one is by Hans Sieber, who says, great presentation. What is new? Is not there a strong parallel to the derailing of globalism into pandemic of nationalism at the beginning of the 20th century? So I think this parallels a question I had before. So is global war ahead of us? So here's a bit of, trying to look ahead is into pessimistic way. And then I'm going to ask the second question at the same time, and then you can choose one or the other and just ask both of them. So the other question says, you mentioned the dissolution of global capitalism as a reason for the emergence of new nationalism, but what about politics in the sense of the rise of China or Southeastern countries? So is nationalism just a rational answer to a more multipolar world? So are we just seeing a different balance of power than the one that we had before into unipolar or hegemonic US one? And it's just the normal response of states towards this. So yeah, these two questions: are we heading towards global war, and what about the rise of other countries in explaining nationalism?
So let me come in first. I mean, the two questions are actually, they're quite closely related to each other. It would be difficult to answer one without the other. So I do think that it is quite clear that the nationalisms we're seeing today are rising out of the end of bi and then unipolarity, right? But I would sort of put it in a slightly different way. It's not so much that they're a response to multipolarity, right? They arise out of the failures of unipolarity, right?
Yeah.
And they arise in the unipole, right? The ex-unipole, out of the failures of unipolarity, as they do out of the. So what's one of the most interesting things is the way in which nationalists in the West have to some extent imported post-colonial nationalist ideas. They've imported a bunch of ideas that really have their origins in critiques of colonialism, actually, right, and of the nationalist response to colonialism. You'll see one of the strange things about European nationalism and American nationalism is all this concern about inward colonialism, right, being colonized by somebody else. And there are reasons for that, and they're both intellectual, but they're also political and historical, which is that this is a world coming to terms with the playing out of colonial history, right, 100 years after the fact, to some extent, right? So unipolarity is indeed tied to what's going on in the rise of nationalisms worldwide, and I think that the multipolar world emerging does appear to be one that will be nationalist. As in, I think there's very little doubt that the next 50 years will be much more nationalist than the last 50. Right? I think there's no doubt about that. And whether that means more war, well, we do know from the past that nationalist states do tend to go to war with each other. And so the question I think we have when looking at international order, and this is a big historic question, is the liberal answer going to deal with a world effectively that is more nationalist, right? Or will more minimal international institutions be necessary to manage and minimize conflict in that kind of world? And the question is, is this kind of maximalist international order or minimalist international order in the context of rising nationalism will dictate how successfully that is balanced, will dictate whether we're heading towards war. I don't believe that history repeats itself. And nor do I think that nationalists have an interest in global nuclear conflict, right? Nor do I think they're inherently irrational or driven by a kind of Nietzschean desire for war, right? I think that nationalists can be quite pragmatic. So I don't know whether we're fated for global war, but I think the world looks much more dangerous than it did, right? And nationalism is tied to that. Please, Pablo, go on.
I want to add that what makes it look like we might be heading to a global war is because that is the claim of nationalists themselves. Mm-hmm. Yeah, from Putin, which is, believe it or not, Putin is on the moderate mainstream side of nationalism today, all the way to the accelerationists that want to help the race war happen now. We wrote about it in our pessimism chapter, in a collection of pessimist views of the world, where there's a global race war coming. And there are terrorists like Tarrant in New Zealand, mosque attack, but also a 60-year-old guy here in Finsbury Park that tried to run over as many people as he could get here outside a mosque here in London, that are trying to make this happen. There's another question I want to answer on the chat, which is you mentioned the dissolution of global capitalism as a reason for the emergence of new nationalism. I don't think global capital has dissolved. I think it's moved into a neoliberal phase where it is actually not dissolved, but much more concentrated. And I would make the case that nationalism is being used, on the one hand, to cover up this colossal concentration of wealth and the results on everyone else. And the power politics that you mentioned in the second half of your question, including the rise of China and the Southeast Asian countries, or the global South, perhaps you meant, is being informed. The rise of China is definitely being informed by ethno-nationalist theory. The rise of China is essentially being strategized on the basis of a reunification of the Chinese race, wherever it might be, and essentially the genocide of the Uyghur people. So I'm not too sure that the power politics of China, India, and Russia right now are independent of the ethnic nationalism. I think they're being driven by the ethnic nationalism. Mm-hmm. And very much so as, and this is the part that I think you're right, to perhaps mitigate or claim that they're doing something to mitigate the huge, colossal, catastrophic, sometimes cataclysmic in the case of Russia, that has to be said for Russia, consequences of economic change.
So, I mean, thank you very much for your answers. And this, I think at the end, it was a very, very lively discussion with lots of questions. So I'm really happy about it. So again, just to repeat, we're here presenting global nationalism, ideas, movements, and dynamics in the 21st century. So please do find the copy. And I think it's very interesting. So there's a lot of discussion on what Pablo and Annie have been talking about, but there's also chapters on Qatar, Ethiopian Jews, the cosmonauts in post-Soviet Russia, Thailand, Singapore, Catalonia, and Spain, Japan, Thailand. So, I mean, all sorts of different perspectives and different dynamics on different parts of the world. So I think there's something for everyone in the book, and I think it's really worth it. So just before we end, I must say that the next event from ASEN, it will be the Gelno Lecture, which will take place on the 2nd of April, where Andrew Wilson will speak on Ukraine at war, baseline identity, and social construction. So I will, following some of the topics that we've covered in this presentation, and that will be followed by the ASEN conference between the 3rd and the 5th of April at Loughborough University, and everyone is of course invited and welcome to come to continue discussions on nationalism, international relations, and war. So thank you very much for everyone for attending, and of course to Pablo and Nick for participating and for answering all the questions. Thank you very much, and that's it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Javier. Thank you for everybody coming. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.